There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from the unknown, but from the known, from the thing you saw and reported and were not believed, from the sound above your ceiling at night that you told yourself was nothing, from the footprints in the snow that led to your door and went no further. Andreas Gruber knew that dread. He lived with it for 6 weeks before it killed him. It is late March, 1922, Bavaria, Germany. The landscape is flat and cold, the fields still half frozen from winter. Scattered across this countryside are small, isolated farmsteads, self-sufficient, remote, connected to the nearest towns by long dirt roads that turn to mud in the thaw. Among these farms, one sits further from its neighbors than most. It is called Hinterkaifeck, a working farm, a family home, and by the end of this story, a graveyard. 6 people live on this farm. Andreas Gruber is the patriarch, 63 years old, weathered, stubborn, a man who has worked this land for decades and trusts almost no one. His wife, Cecilia, is 72, quiet, devoted to the rhythms of farm life. Their daughter, Victoria, is 35, a widow. Her husband, Carl Gabriel, died fighting in World War I, and she has been raising her 2 children alone on the family farm ever since. Those children are young Cecilia, 7 years old, and Joseph, who has just turned 2. And then there is Maria Baumgartner, the new maid. She arrived at Hinterkaifeck on March 31st, 1922, carrying her belongings, ready to begin her new position. She was 44 years old. She had no idea what had been happening at this farm in the weeks before she arrived. Nobody told her. She would be dead within hours. To understand what happened on the night of March 31st, you first have to go back to the weeks before. Because the horror of Hinterkaifeck did not begin with 6 murders. It began quietly, subtly, with small things that didn't make sense. It began with footprints. Several weeks before the murders, Andreas Gruber walked out onto his land one morning and found tracks in the snow. They came from the direction of the forest, that dense, dark tree line at the edge of the property, and they led directly to the farm, to the house, to the outbuildings. He followed them, he studied them, and then he noticed something that turned his blood cold. They didn't go back. Whoever had walked out of that forest and up to his farm had not turned around. The tracks simply stopped, as though the person who made them had stepped up to the Gruber property and vanished. Andreas reported this to his neighbors. He was not a fearful man. He was practical, gruff, dismissive of sentiment, but this bothered him enough to mention it, and his neighbors, hearing it, were unsettled. Nobody could explain it. But the footprints were only the beginning. Around the same time, Andreas discovered something else on the property, a newspaper. Sitting on the farm, apparently left there by someone, but it was not a paper that any member of the household had bought or ordered. No one recognized it. No one knew how it had got there. It had simply appeared, the way a message appears when someone wants you to know they've been watching. Then a house key went missing. One of the farm's keys vanished without explanation. No one had lost it. No one had moved it. It was simply gone. And in an isolated farmstead in 1922, a missing key is not a minor inconvenience. It is a threat. And then came the nights. The family began to hear sounds from the attic. Footsteps, movement. The slow, deliberate creak of weight shifting in the space above their heads as they lay in their beds in the dark. Andreas investigated. He found nothing, or nothing he was willing to tell others about. He reported the sounds, the same way he had reported the footprints, to his neighbors, and his neighbors urged him to go to the police. He didn't. Why? We will never know for certain. Andreas Gruber was not a man who sought outside help. He was not a man who showed fear. Perhaps he told himself it was animals. Perhaps he had his own suspicions about who was responsible and believed he could handle it himself. Perhaps there were things happening at Hinterkaifeck that he could not afford to have a police investigation uncover, because Hinterkaifeck had secrets that went far deeper than footprints in the snow. The village had been talking for years, quietly, in the way that rural communities talk about things they find shameful and cannot look away from. The talk was about Victoria's son, about Joseph, the 2-year-old boy sleeping in his crib on that farm, about who his father really was. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had died in 1914. Joseph was born in 1919. The math did not work, and the rumors that filled that gap were devastating. The village whispered that Andreas Gruber, Victoria's own father, had fathered the child. This was not idle gossip. It was serious enough that legal proceedings had actually been brought against Andreas years earlier. He had been convicted of incest in 1915 following the birth of an earlier child with Victoria, a child who had not survived. He served time. He returned to the farm, and apparently nothing changed. This is the shadow that hangs over everything at Hinterkaifeck. A family living in enforced isolation, bound together by shame and secrets, presided over by a patriarch who controlled everything and answered to no one. A household that the outside world could not easily see into, and that perhaps suited certain people very well. Now enter Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer was a neighbor, a farmer, a man who had known the Grubers for years. He was also, according to persistent rumors, the biological father of little Joseph, a claim he sometimes acknowledged and sometimes denied depending on who was asking and when. He and Andreas Gruber had been locked in a bitter financial dispute. There were arguments about money, about the child, about things that had passed between them that were never fully disclosed. He was also the man who, on April 4th, 1922, led the group that discovered the bodies. 4 days had passed since the murders. A neighbor had noticed that no one from Hinterkaifeck had come to collect the mail. The postal worker had made a pass, and the farm had sent no one. Lorenz Schlittenbauer organized a small group, himself and 2 other men, and they walked up to the farm to check on the family. What they found should have been a crime scene. Instead, it became something stranger. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the fire in the kitchen was burning, still burning, after 4 days. The cattle in their stalls had been fed. The rabbits were tended to. The farm was, in every external appearance, operational. It looked like someone was home. And then they went to the barn. Andreas Gruber was there, and Cecilia, his wife, and Victoria, and young Cecilia, 7 years old. All of them in the barn, covered in hay, killed by blunt force trauma consistent with a mattock, a heavy farm tool later found on the property. Inside the house, they found little Joseph in his crib, and Maria Baumgartner in her room, the new maid, dead on her first day of work. 6 bodies, 4 days, and the fire was still burning. This is the detail that changes everything. That fire, those fed animals, that maintained operational farm with 6 corpses inside it. The killer did not run. After murdering 6 people, including a 7-year-old girl and a 2-year-old boy, whoever did this did not flee into the night. They stayed. They slept in that house. They woke up in the mornings and fed the cattle and tended the rabbits and put wood on the fire for days, moving through that farmstead with what can only be described as extraordinary calm. Forensic analysis, limited as it was for the era, suggested the killer remained on the property for at least 2 to 3 days after the murders, possibly longer, long enough to be comfortable, long enough to feel, in some deeply disturbing way, at home. Think about what that tells us about who this person was. This was not panic. This was not confusion. This was not someone who killed impulsively and then didn't know what to do. This was someone who had planned, who was prepared, and who, when it was over, had nowhere else to be, or chose not to leave. The investigation that followed was extensive and ultimately futile. Police from Munich arrived and began working through the case. They photographed the scene, conducted autopsies, interviewed neighbors, traced the movements of the Gruber family in the weeks before the murders. The mattock was recovered. A list of suspects began to form, but the case was plagued from the start. When Schlittenbauer and the other men had entered the farm on April 4th, they had moved the bodies before police arrived. They had walked through the crime scene, touched surfaces, disturbed the barn. Whether this was done out of genuine shock and grief or for other reasons, the contamination was severe. Evidence that might have identified the killer, footprints, fingerprints, trace material, was compromised or destroyed before investigators even got there. Schlittenbauer himself was looked at hard by detectives. His connections to the family, his dispute with Andreas, his possible paternity of Josef, it all made him a compelling suspect. He was questioned multiple times. He gave inconsistent answers on certain points, but there was never enough to charge him. He lived out the rest of his life in the region and died in 1941. There was also the matter of the previous maid, Crescence Rieger. She had worked at Hinterkaifeck before Maria Baumgartner and had left abruptly, refusing to go back. When investigators spoke to her, she said the farm had frightened her. She wouldn't be specific. She said only that something was wrong there, that something was present that should not have been. She couldn't or wouldn't say more. Whatever she had seen or experienced at Hinterkaifeck had been enough to make her walk away from a paying job in the middle of winter. Maria Baumgartner did not have the benefit of that warning. Over the following years, investigators pursued dozens of leads. Traveling craftsmen were looked into. It was common in that era for itinerant workers to pass through remote farms, and some investigators theorized that one such man, perhaps someone who knew the layout of the property, could have sheltered there and killed the family. Vagrant workers, local feuds, financial disputes, every thread was pulled. None of them led anywhere solid. And then the war came, and with it, the fire that ended whatever chance remained of solving Hinterkaifeck. During World War II, the Munich police headquarters was bombed. The building that housed the original Hinterkaifeck case files, the photographs, the witness statements, the physical evidence logs, the investigators' notes accumulated over 2 decades of inquiry, was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed, gone. What survives today are fragments, copies that journalists had made, second-hand accounts, partial records preserved by accident or foresight, enough to reconstruct the outline of the case, not enough to close it. In 2007, 85 years after the murders, German authorities made one final attempt. A team of criminology students at the police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck, working alongside forensic experts, reopened the investigation as a serious academic and forensic exercise. They had access to preserved biological material, bone fragments and cranial matter from the victims that had been held in a Munich forensic collection since the 1920s, untouched, waiting. They extracted DNA. They matched the victims' profiles to living descendants of the Gruber family, confirming identities. They used modern forensic analysis to refine timelines and reassess the evidence. They built a new suspect list, applied fresh methodology, and worked through the case with tools that the original investigators could not have imagined. And at the end of it, they had nothing new. No suspect profile, no DNA match to an unknown contributor, no breakthrough. The Bavarian State Criminal Office formally closed the case without an arrest, without charges, without a conclusion. The murders at Hinterkaifeck remain, officially and completely, unsolved. The farmstead no longer exists. Within a year of the murders, the buildings were demolished. The local community wanted them gone, wanted no monument to what had happened there, no structure standing in that field that people would have to look at and remember. The land was cleared. The forest grew back around it. Today, a small, simple memorial marks the spot. Most people who drive through that part of Bavaria have never heard of it. The trees are tall now. The field is quiet. In winter, when the ground is hard and the light is low, it looks like any other patch of German countryside. But if you stand there long enough, and you think about what happened in those weeks before March 31st, 1922, the footprints that didn't return, the newspaper that appeared from nowhere, the key that vanished, the sounds in the attic at night, you start to feel the shape of it, the patience of it, the terrible, deliberate calm of someone who had already decided what they were going to do and was simply waiting for the right moment. Someone who knew that farm, who knew that family, who knew that no one would come. 6 people, 6 murders, one killer who was never found, never charged, never named, who walked out of that forest or perhaps was already inside that house and when it was over, simply stayed. The attic at Hinterkaifeck is gone now, but whatever moved through it in those cold nights in early 1922, whatever weight pressed against those floorboards in the dark while the family lay awake below, that is still here, in the case files that survived the fire, in the memories passed down through the villages around Schrobenhausen, in the question that 100 years of investigation has never been able to answer. Who was up there? If this story found you in the dark, good. That's where it belongs. Subscribe, and we'll see you next time.